City of Stevens Point Personnel Committee meeting, recorded September 9, 2024.
It is 6 o'clock. I will call the Personnel Committee meeting to order. Manager Fresh, could we get a roll call?
Alder Guthrie?
Here.
Alder Broderick?
Here.
Chair Nebo?
Here?
Alder Lang?
Here.
Alder Steinmetz?
Here.
We're good. We have a quorum. First item on the agenda is a presentation and a discussion on forms of governance in Wisconsin municipalities by Dr. Michael Ford from University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, I believe.
That is correct.
Appreciate you coming, and we'll let you get started. Just come up to the lectern and...
Right here. All right, I'll try to keep this under a couple hours if possible. I'm kidding, I'll be efficient.
Let me, well, what do I gotta do here? I gotta share it out, so stand by. Share. That should do it. Not looking good. Share. All right, I think we're good.
All right, good to go. As you can see, my title here is Professional Management of Wisconsin Municipalities. I should start by saying professional management, we're just referring to a city manager or an administrator. It's not to imply that an elected mayor is somehow not a professional. That has come up before, believe it or not. But I'm here to give you a little bit of an idea of different government forms in Wisconsin, pros and cons, share some data, then hopefully answer any questions you may have. Yeah, do you want to just click that for me?
It worked when we started, I
did.
swear.
There we go. So, like I said, Michael Ford, I am a professor of public administration at UW-Oshkosh. I also am the director of the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research. And if you don't know anything about the Whitburn Center, we're basically an academic think tank dedicated to practice, basically showing that we can still govern in Wisconsin. So we do a lot of this type of work around the state. In fact, I'm going to be in De Pere tomorrow night doing exactly the same presentation. So don't tell them how it went. A little bit about my background.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. A little bit about my background. I've been in and around state and local government my entire career, going back to about 2004. I served on the Oshkosh Common Council, which is a Chapter 64 management city, for 4 years. Served on the Plan Commission, I think, for 6 years, and a couple other things in local government. So I definitely come at this with an idea towards practice, not just some type of academic exercise. Now you can click it, and you can click right through the next one. If you're really interested, we have a really fun advisory board I like to show off. But that's our mission statement. But you can go to the next slide. Let's get to the meat of it. So the logic of professional management, this goes back to really the machine era of politics, where corruption was rampant in local government. I don't know if you ever watched like Boardwalk Empire. We're talking about that era, so it goes way back in time. But the basic logic here is that politics decides and administration does, that we can bring in a city manager or a city administrator to handle the day-to-day operations of local government, while we have a political body like a council handles the political side. Go to the next slide. And that's about as artistic as I get. You'll see I got one more artistic slide. But that Venn diagram, I think, describes the logic of professional management. So the city manager is really the executive, the day-to-day. They are the ones that are overseeing the operations of city government, whereas the political arm, the city council, is really there to set the agenda, translate the values and the goals of the electorate into a cohesive plan that the city manager gets to execute. So again, that Venn diagram is basically showing the city manager role is managing everybody, managing the budget, and hopefully bringing some specific skills to being that chief operating officer for the municipality, but also has to deal with the political side of things, that is managing the council and being managed by the council. There's two types of professionally managed cities in Wisconsin. There's Chapter 64, and I did bring that if anyone's really interested in being bored and reading state statutes. But that's kind of the old school way of establishing a city manager in local government. Chapter 64 really lays out in detail the specific structures of a city manager form of government. Moving to that type of government requires you changing your charter ordinance. That requires a 2/3 majority vote by your governing body, and that's also also subject to referendum. You can choose to go to referendum to change your charter ordinance, or if you do it by yourself, people can petition to have it go to referendum. So oftentimes, if you're making a switch to a Chapter 64 city, you're going to have to go directly to the people to do it. Much more common in Wisconsin is the ordinance model. That's what I call this. It can be established, basically a hybrid model, where a municipality can decide how they want their administrator to interact with their elected officials. A lot of flexibility there. You can pretty much do what you want. You can do it through a change to your charter ordinance, which can also be subject to referendum, or you could actually just do it through simple ordinance. And I'll show some numbers for you in a second about how common that form is. Here we go. And I think that's important. The reason I bring that up is you might look at Chapter 64 cities. I think was there 10 of them? Yeah, 10 of them in Wisconsin. And you think, okay, this is like a rare thing. Not many people have this form of government. But if you look at the simple ordinance cities, 91 have some type of administrator or professional manager that's hired. So really not the vast majority, but the majority of cities in the state of Wisconsin do have some type of professional administrator overseeing the administrative duties of their local government. Villages can also do this. I don't focus too much on the villages in this presentation because Stevens Point is a city, but at least want to bring that up too, that there are Chapter 64 villages, and those are primarily in the Milwaukee suburbs, and 54 other villages we were able to identify that do have some type of administrator through a simple ordinance. So again, that should just answer your question that this is not some rare concept in Wisconsin. Biggest question I get when I'm talking about this is it anti-democratic? And that's such a loaded question, right? I can say, yes, it is, or no, it's not. But I'm not going to say either of those. It is different. It is different than what you have here. Right now, if no offense to the mayor, but if the residents of Stevens Point don't like the day-to-day management of the city, they can vote you directly out of office. If you were city administrator, you work directly for the council. So the public can still vote you out of office by changing the makeup of the council or making it known that they want to change, but it's going to be up to the council to make that decision to hire, fire, evaluate a city administrator. So it is a different type of democratic accountability than you currently have. And I think it's really important to point out that under this form of government, the city council has exactly one employee, and that's the city manager. So I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about the importance of boundary setting and avoiding that role confusion and the ways that professionally managed cities can get derailed. I think it's important to point out that you can still have a mayor. What that looks like, though, is going to be very different than a strong mayor that you have right now. That's a compliment, Mayor Wiese. Right, it's someone who can preside over the council meetings, someone that performs ceremonial duties. I can tell you in Oshkosh, with the Chapter 64 city, the mayor and the city manager work pretty closely in setting the agendas for council meetings. The mayor takes the lead on appointments for boards and commissions, with the council having the ability to either veto it or vote it through. They have to approve it, but it's not a full-time position. It's definitely not running the day-to-day operations of government. So you still might call it a mayor. Other cities call it a council president. There's flexibility in how that works. A lot of municipalities will have a council president that's selected by the city council. But some cities, like Eau Claire, I was just up there last week doing a very similar talk. They're a Chapter 64 city, but they have a directly elected council president. Again, all kind of has the same duty, but I think it's important to point out that when we talk about a mayor, an administrative form of government, it's not like what you have now. It's a ceremonial position that might have unique duties in addition to being a council member, but it really is just a council member with a little bit more responsibility. So who does what? And I don't mean to insult your intelligence, because this doesn't look all that different than what you're doing right now. But the council is going to have the high-level goal setting, being that bridge between the public and local government, figuring out the size and scope of the services that you're going to provide. Still going to vote on the budget, still going to work on policy creation. But again, the big one is you as a council would evaluate and give direction to the city manager. So that's, again, I think the big difference for a council in this form of government. The city manager, managing, hiring, firing staff, deploying resources, reporting on goals, implementing policies. Again, a lot of the stuff that a strong mayor currently does right now, but under this form of government, at least the idea is you'd be insulated from some of those political considerations. So, can the city manager be political? This is another loaded question, because the thing about human beings is they don't always follow all the rules. International City County Management Association is the big international professional association for hired administrators and professional managers, and they have a pretty strong code of ethics that administrators sign on to. And to give you an idea, I'm a professor of public administration. We're a master's of public admin program. Have a student chapter of ICMA. I think we have about 25 city managers around the state of Wisconsin right now that have come through the UW-Oshkosh program. So we certainly instill this ideal of insulating yourself from political activity, but I'd be lying if I said that it doesn't occasionally still happen. But again, ideally, a city manager is not engaging in any type of political activity. They serve an indefinite term, so they serve at the will of the council. Under the ICMA Code of Ethics, you have to commit to 2 years in a place. So the idea is that you're not going to have a city manager that you hire, and then a year later they find a different opportunity. But that doesn't mean you have to keep somebody for 2 years. You're able to get rid of a city manager when you want to. I will say one of the ways that a city manager does influence the policy process that doesn't get talked about enough is just the way they present information. Being that person in charge of the bureaucracy, having the department heads report directly to you, the options you give your council, how you choose to report things, is absolutely going to have an impact on that governing body. So that's something to keep in mind. Oh, the charts. I love my charts. So this is just looking at the size of different municipalities in Wisconsin by form of government. And the blue are cities, so let's pay most attention to those. But right in the middle is your Chapter 64 cities. So that's like Oshkosh, West Allis, Racine, Eau Claire. So more of your larger, medium-sized cities. That sounds like a misnomer. But if you look at mid-sized cities in Wisconsin, on the larger end, you're more likely to have a Chapter 64 municipality. The ones that have an administrator through a simple ordinance tend to be smaller. And just looking, if I recall, Stevens Point's what, about 23,000 people or so?
25 some.
Yeah, so I mean, you're kind of right in the middle of the average size for administrative-led cities, whereas a lot of the smaller cities in Wisconsin do not have an administrator. It tends to be more on the edges that have a strong mayor, so places like Stevens Point that might be a little larger, and then a lot of smaller municipalities that might not have the time, or not the time, might not have the money or the need to have a professional administrator. And I include that size because I think that is really important for understanding this graph. This is just Department of Revenue data, the latest, just looking at the different financial characteristics of cities by administrative type. Couple things to caution, these are averages. So just because this chart is showing, for example, administrator-led cities have a slightly higher property tax per capita, doesn't mean all of them do. I also think a lot of these financial differences are a function of administrator-led cities being larger on average, not necessarily a result of government form, but nonetheless, I think important to point out. Administrator-led cities, especially Chapter 64 ones, tend to be lower spending overall per capita, but they do spend more on law enforcement per capita than cities with strong mayors. You'll notice that shared revenue per capita is lower for administrator-led cities, which kind of explains why your property taxes are higher per capita in these municipalities. And that's something that I would argue is an accident of history, but that's a whole other discussion that we can have. I'm sure you never talk about shared revenue in this body, right? TIF is probably the most interesting one here, where your Chapter 64 cities tend to have the lowest TIF levy per capita compared to both other administrator-led cities and strong mayor cities. But again, I share this, and I say take this with a grain of salt, because a lot of that might be a function of the size of the municipality as opposed to government form. This is the result of a survey we did at the Whitburn Center of council members serving in both strong mayor cities and in administrator-led cities. And here I think there's some more interesting things that I think we can take some conclusions away from. So these are all statements on a scale 1 to 5, a Likert scale, asked council members around the state, to what extent do you agree? 1 being strongly disagree with the statement, 5 being strongly agree. So the higher the number, the more likely a council member from these types of governments agreed with these statements. And the little star there just shows where there's a statistical significance. Sorry, I teach research methods too, so I can't help myself. I put that star up there, or my old PhD advisor is going to yell at me. A couple things that stick out. Administrator-led cities report that they're more likely to utilize the strategic planning process and not just see it as a document that they put away in their drawer and don't look at in the future. More likely to have stronger performance measures to measure the performance of specific areas of their local government. More likely to view the executive as a full partner in the governing process, which I think makes just a heck of a lot of sense, because if it's somebody you're hiring directly, I'd like to think that they're viewed as a strong partner for you, so that's not earth-shattering. And then those other ones at the bottom, those are a series of statements I use to measure the small group dynamics of governing councils, specifically the level of trust and openness. And it does come to light that the city councils and administrator-led cities tend to have more trusting relationships and a little lower levels of destructive conflict, like relationship conflict, than non-administrator-led cities. But once again, I caution, these are averages. Next one, please. This is a survey we did of the Whitburn Center last year, through the Whitburn Center last year, of strong mayors and city managers around the state of Wisconsin. And the whole purpose of this survey was really to look at their human capital needs and the state of their human resource operations. When I say state of the human resource operations, I don't mean how efficient they are, but levels of turnover, challenges you might be having attracting people. And this, I thought, was pretty interesting. Administrators were more likely than strong mayors to say that they have an opportunity to reward their employees for good performance. Non-administrator-led cities are more likely to cite organizational culture and work-life balance as barriers to attracting employees. And administrator-led cities had lower levels of turnover for their staff and higher retention rates. Again, I share that, but I also want to caution, again, that your administrator-led cities tend to be in larger areas where they might have a deeper human capital pool. So some of this might be just a reality that, hey, a lot of these smaller rural municipalities that have strong mayors are having trouble getting people there. So I think there's a geographic thing going on here as well. Reform adoption. This is another area that stuck out. We asked a series of questions about model reforms that you might have adopted. And I've been on this kick really since 2012 after Act 10 went through in Wisconsin and municipalities started replacing their old union contracts with these employee manuals. And just curious, what type of reforms are you implementing? And just breaking it up by government type, you see the blue are municipalities with a professional administrator, orange are the ones with a strong mayor. And administrator-led cities are more likely to have employee performance pay operations, more likely to contract out services that were previously done in-house, more likely to offer tuition remission for employees, prioritize diversity and recruitment, and then offer relocation packages. But again, standard caution here. Don't forget size, because I do think that's showing up here as well. I also think it's notable, and this is really not about government form, but it's notable about how many municipalities across Wisconsin are doing a lot of these things. See, now that is my best slide, right? Those are my linkages. This is where I've wasted a dozen years of my life. Not wasted, I've wisely spent, but so really trying to give you an idea of how this can work in practice. If you were to switch government forms, you had an administrator, how is it successful? What makes it successful? And that little Venn diagram at the bottom, I think really, at least in my tiny brain, highlights how it works. Is you're taking this group and you're turning it into a different type of governance team. Not that you aren't a governance team now, but it's a little bit of a different type of a governance team, where you have the council, which is the political arm, you have the administrative arm, which is managing city staff, and then you certainly have resources, whether that's shared revenue, whether that's, geographic advantages, economic tax base, all that fun stuff. But I think where this form of government works is when you are able to really maximize that area in the middle, where your council priorities, your administrative capacity, and your resource availability overlaps. So the goal in this type of government, and I say this type of government, I think this is the goal in any type of local government, is to maximize that common area where everyone's aligned. So the way that works in practice is these fun linkages. As a council, it's up to you to really be able to have a coherent and clear message that you can translate to your city administrator. I compare it to a giant game of telephone. I have two little kids, and that's always fun when they play a game of telephone because all it takes is one of them to screw it all up. Sometimes they do it on purpose. Sometimes they do it by accident. Sometimes there's a lot of background noise. But I think that translates into local government. And I think it's particularly important in an administrator-led form of government where you don't have the keys to the day-to-day operation of government. You need to be able to work productively as a council, align your priorities, align your core values, whether that's through a strategic planning process, a values roadmap, board training, something, so that you can give a clear message to your administrator. And that's an area where you're cooperating, where if you're able to give clear guidance to your administrative head's able to translate that to their department heads and actually able to execute it, set up appropriate feedback mechanisms when things don't go as planned, and then hopefully get to the point where you're executing that vision. And certainly if it's not happening, on a council end, you can do some type of internal work to see how you're getting derailed. Sometimes it's the city manager that's derailing it, and that means it's time to move on to a different administrator. Go to the next slide. Different ways it can get derailed. I mean, the most common way is just role confusion, where people don't understand what the role of the administrator is and don't understand what the role of a council member is. Then people start stepping on each other's toes, and it's not clear who's in charge of what. Oftentimes, I find that can happen if people don't understand the form of government and are operating in it. I think it's a source of great frustration in some municipalities where a council member comes in and says, I'm coming here because I'm going to, reform the planning department and fire all these inspectors that are giving my neighbors a hard time. And then they get there and realize they don't have the power to do that. To me, that's an educational failure in my humble opinion, but it absolutely does happen. This form of government can get derailed by non-substantive council conflict. And what do I mean by that? Conflict is good. You should disagree with each other on things because you're all representing, in this case, different districts, different constituencies. But if you're fighting about stuff that doesn't matter, if you're spending all of your time fighting about what the city manager should or should not be in charge of, you're spending all your time fighting about relationships, that's where you get derailed. Because if you're not able to articulate that message to the city administrator, that puts the city administrator in a terrible position. Either they're just going to do whatever they want to do and half the council is going to be mad, or maybe more of the council is going to be mad, or you can have the case where a manager gets a lot of power and starts to really be the one running the city because the council can't get their act together. So it's so important to have a strong council in this form of government. That said, if you have a council that doesn't buy into it, that's problematic. Because if you don't respect the idea of boundaries between the administrative side of the government and the political side, that's going to derail the whole thing. It's not going to work well. And then I guess I should have asked, how many alder people do we have here? 9?
11.
We have 11.
11. So that I should have said 12. So I was thinking of Oshkosh with our 7 council members. But this is a phenomenon that happens all over the country where you have a city manager that operates as, in this case, would be the 12th council member and engaging in that political activity. And that's usually a sign that you need to get a new city manager, but again, easier said than done. Next one. So here's the best question. Is it right for you? And this is always, I think, important to point out that it's not a panacea. You can't just expect, right, we're having issues, so we're going to move to professionally managed government, and now all our issues go away. And I say the same thing when I talk to municipalities that have a professional manager and want to go to a strong mayor. I said, both can work. Both do work in many places, both don't work in other places, but they're different. So the important thing is, can it work for you? So things to consider is what's the culture here, in Stephen's point? Would the public be accepting of a change? Is that something they would want? Do stakeholders on the council, if you were to move in this direction, feel capable and want to be able to explain and educate and sell this idea? Just kind of summarizing here, I mean, the presented data, and I'm happy to answer any questions after this because I know we're going through this quickly because I want to be respectful of your time. But my standard recommendation based on the data is if you are a municipality that's struggling to attract employees, having a difficult time coalescing around reforms, struggling with a high conflict board, and then perhaps most importantly, if you're a politically divided community where you have these dramatic swings in executive leadership, that's an area where I think professional management can be a really good thing because you can have some continuity to implement some of your larger projects. Whereas if you have a municipality that's like 50-50 ideologically and you're just every 2 years cleaning house, that's a problem. Next slide. Process for making a change, and this is where the legal department would obviously be involved. But I alluded to it before, but a Chapter 64 city, if you were to go that route, which has a little less flexibility but a little more structure to it, you need to get a 2/3 vote of your governing body and possibly a referendum. Whereas if you were to do it the more common way, through just a simple ordinance, you have a lot more flexibility in how you might accomplish that. And I guess last but not least, and you can go to the final slide, I just want to caution too that I should have said this when I mentioned where this process gets derailed. When it's a product of personalities, I think that's a problem. We've had situations that I've observed, people have reached out to me and said that I don't like our mayor, we're going to change our form of government. I'm like, well, that's really, if your goal is simply to get rid of an individual because you don't like their leadership, this is not the way to do it. That's why we have elections. Changing the form of government is a pretty dramatic step if you just want to change a personality. And that's always my caution, one way or the other, for municipalities considering this or municipalities considering moving away from this. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I'll start with the committee. Anybody on the committee have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Firstly, thank you for putting this together. This was fantastically informative. I'm
Good.
particularly curious about the survey results that you had shown.
Yeah.
And I'm a little concerned by the fact that, like, the size of the municipality is such a confounding variable there. Is
Yeah.
there some way to get that data to look at controlling for that, doing like a matched sample of some kind to try?
Yeah, there is. So I was trying to avoid an in-depth discussion of regression analysis because that's my spring semester. But yes, there is, and I can share that with you. And if you go to the website, we actually do some of that. We have a report specifically about this issue, and I can say that the small group dynamic advantages and some of the financial stuff does hold up even for size. So again, I think it's always important to have that caution because we are dealing with 190 cities that are vastly unique in their context. And that's something that, right, I can do all the mathematical modeling that addresses for that, but I don't know, it's the Bob Dylan quote, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. I mean, right, Stevens Point's going to be different than, is it Park Ridge or something? I forget. There was a town I drove through on the way in here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Alder Lang, I think you had a question or two?
I had a couple of them. So what we're presented here is a couple different forms of government that I had some questions about where we are, because some things that I heard in there, I don't necessarily understand if that's true or not.
Yeah.
So from what I'm seeing is there's hybrid forms. That's the point that I would like to get
Yeah.
to. Is like there's, depending on how you as a city decide to write your ordinances, you could have something in between any of these sort of things. And
You could.
there are cities that have that, is what I understand. So
There are.
So that's kind of what my question would be, is kind of like, what brings us here is, what do we have right now? This is the thing that I would hope to get some clarity on, because I find that we are kind of a hybrid system.
Yeah.
Not that we have a city admin or a city manager at this point,
Yeah.
but we're not necessarily a strong or a weak mayor system. We kind of have a hybrid right now. We have something in between.
Yeah.
And I'd like to try and get that cleared up for the record at this point. Our mayor has some strong mayor sort by ordinance, and there's some weak stuff in there because it has to get mayor and council, so
Yeah.
that part of it I'd like to try and, for the public and us on, it's like we're somewhere in between. And I think that needs to be understood, is that we have some things that we do like a strong mayor's city council system, and some things that we do like a weak mayor city council system. Bringing in the discussion of what would be a city administrator,
Yeah.
that default goes to weak, is that what I'm understanding? Or is there still hybrid options for
There's definitely under that, right, the Chapter 64, I mean, that's city manager, weak mayor.
Okay.
Right, if you adopt it through a simple ordinance, yeah, there's a continuum there.
Okay.
A way, well, I'll share an example. They might not like this, but I'm going to share it anyways. De Pere, where I'm going tomorrow, they have an administrator right now, and they have a elected mayor that has, strong mayor characteristics, but has voluntarily decided to let the administrator handle a lot of the day-to-day operations. And one of the things they're looking at is trying to put that into ordinance to make a change to Chapter 64 to solidify that, because it might work well right now. I think their concern is who's to say if there's a mayor that doesn't come in and doesn't buy into it. So that's, again, a long way of saying that it's really up to the legislative body to decide where they want to be on that continuum. And if you do want to have a mayor that has some of those powers, just being really clear where those lines are. I will caution, though, that also has an impact on who you're able to attract, who would want to operate and work in these types of different systems.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I've got
Alder
one.
Steinmetz?
Yeah.
I'm interested to know if these larger cities have administrators. Do they get administrators because they're large? Or do they become large because they have an administrator? Is there a correlation in growth trajectory?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say the Chapter 64, I always think of that as like the old lumbering beast. I mean, that really is just, decisions made 70 or 80 years ago where some of your larger municipalities that weren't your Milwaukee's, your Green Bay's, your Madison, but your larger cities of the second, third, and fourth class adopted that model. I would say, especially the villages that I mentioned, that has been a product of growth, that as local governments are being asked to do more, have more professionalization, they find it helpful to switch to an administrator form, to bring in somebody to manage the complexities of the organization. So I would certainly say that, yeah, a lot of the places where you've seen it grow have been, or adopted, in that hybrid model or the simple ordinance model, are places where there is growth.
Is there like an average population where when people make the switch?
That I don't
roughly
know.
what that is?
You're giving me good research ideas here.
I went to Oshkosh too.
Excellent. That I don't know, but I can certainly look into that, because that would be fascinating. Yeah, I don't know if there's a magic number there, but there might be.
Okay.
Questions from our city attorney? Go ahead.
Yeah.
I certainly don't mean to hijack. I think it was an excellent presentation. There's just two things I want to clarify. First of all, over the years, I've heard a lot of references to this strong mayor versus weak mayor. And I just want to clarify, that is language born out of political science, not out of law. Attorneys don't ever talk about that stuff. The statutes, case law don't refer to those terms. So they are descriptive, but they're not technical legal terms. The thing I wanted to talk about a little bit more, though, is charter ordinance. So obviously there was a couple references to changing your charter ordinance, or our charter ordinance, which is kind of accurate and also very slightly not accurate. So what I'm trying to avoid here is confusion, obviously, but also a whole bunch of people going home and emailing or picking up the phone to call me or the clerk's office asking to see a copy of our charter ordinance, because I will just simply direct them to Chapter 62 of the state statutes, and off you go to read it. We have what's called the general charter law in the state of Wisconsin. That is Chapter 62. So back in the day, when there was the Wild West, almost literally, you had cities creating their own charters, and there was a whole kaleidoscope of crazy, crazy stuff. And the legislature eventually, probably at the behest of companies that were trying to operate in multiple cities, said, no, those are all abolished, and you all have the general charter law. But there are rules within it that say if you want to deviate from this, you can, but here's the process by which you do that. That you can refer to that as changing your charter, but really it's just the charter ordinance process. So I know that sounds like a little bit of a splitting hairs thing. Probably in the context that's the most important here, it would be that, okay, so if we created a city administrator position but didn't make any other changes whatsoever, you give it a job description, all this, well, Chapter 62 says that the mayor is the chief executive of the city and directs operations and directs the department heads and all that stuff. So if you create a city administrator position without altering that, well, what have you really done? So most likely, and in most cases, if you create a city administrator position via sort of the ordinance route that was referred to, you'd be modifying your ordinances to change the executive authority of the mayor and allocating those powers to the administrator. And that would require this charter ordinance process, which again is, as accurately stated here, the city council can pass that. There's a 60-day period after its publication during which somebody can file a petition, and I believe it's 7% of the number of votes that were cast for governor in the most recent election, which, if you recall, the petition we had about the transportation funding referendum and all that, that number, if I recall correctly, was actually double that. So this would be a lower threshold, which I guess would put it at maybe like 1,700 or something like that. Maybe I might even be overstating it, but yeah, so copy of our charter ordinance, it's just the state statutes.
Thank you. Any of the other alders have a question first, and then Alder Christensen.
First of all, I'd like to thank you too. Excellent presentation. It's a lot of good information. After listening to what Logan just explained, I was thinking back to the article in the June issue of the League of Municipalities and the municipality. It was the June issue, and it stated something about a structure where you remained under Chapter 62, and the mayor still kept overriding control, but his control over day-to-day operations was through supervision of the city administrator. So they were describing a situation where you were still under Chapter 62. The city administrator did the direct contact with and was basically operating almost as a delegated authority from the mayor. Have you heard of that type of situation?
Yeah. I mean, that's right. That's the most common way that municipalities adopt this. That's the non-Chapter 64 option, where you're keeping under that Chapter 62 and you're hiring an administrator. Please.
And then does that require a charter ordinance change, or is that just a simple ordinance change?
Well, as to put words in the city attorney's mouth, it doesn't technically require it, but as he pointed out, if he did it through a simple ordinance, does it actually change much? Only if folks, I guess, accept it and adopt it. And right, charter ordinance is a stronger way to do it.
Anybody else? Alder Morrow.
Yeah, please.
Alder Morrow, Area 11. One of the questions I have is I know that some municipalities have gone through a lot of them, city administrators and so on. What is the most common? I mean, because I know that the council's able to fire them, but what's the ramifications of that on average? Because I know there's probably a payout package for that and so on.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit more about that, like what you've seen a lot of places?
Zach, would you want to? Yeah, I see Zach nodding his head.
Yeah, it's a great question. Hi, everybody. Zach Brewink, Chief Operating Officer at the League. Thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight. I went to City Hall, so I didn't follow my instructions to get here. Great question. So you may recognize me from being just down the road at the suburb of Stevens Point, Wisconsin Rapids. I was the mayor there for 8 years. The question about the turnover, prior to me joining the League, I was the administrator in Rhinelander for 2.5 years, and there's a very storied and written about history in Rhinelander. 7 administrators, I think the stat is, in 6 years, and I was the 7th. It was an interesting placement. It happened kind of during COVID, also a very interesting time in the world. But I think what Mike had talked about in terms of the recipe for success, Rhinelander didn't have that figured out, and I think it was a confluence of factors there. I mean, personality certainly is an element of it, but it was, kind of everyone's responsibility and challenge to everybody had some sort of responsibility in that. And I think that when I was there for 2.5 years, ended up being there that long, I kind of look back and I was like, well, what was different? It really was a lot of the players had changed, and that was a big part of it, and the community really had more of a forward-looking forward-looking focus as opposed to kind of a adversarial relationship both between the administration, city staff, and the council. So it really was the confluence of the success thing. The other thing I'll comment on, and I appreciate the attorney's distinction there. I say to my league attorney, she's like, what are you going to Stevens Point for? I said, I'm going to go to talk about strong mayors. She goes, Zach, strong mayors don't exist. And I said, I know, Maria, they don't exist, but it's the term, it's the reference. And I think, having served both as a strong mayor and as an administrator is an amazing experience and perspective. But I think having sort of governance, the collectiveness and the collective will and the direction, sort of a consensus around that is always critical. And I don't think your form of government is really a variable in that question. You really need to have sort of that strong foundation of planning and community outlook and kind of oversight. So as the league, we've been around for 126 years. We've seen all of these models exist, and yes, the spectrum that was reported in the League magazine, thanks for the reference to the June edition. Kurt, my predecessor, wrote, I think, that article and did a great job explaining and articulating just how these things work around the state. And I think there are some great successful examples in each setting. But the league exists to present the information and not to tell you what's the best route and path forward. And certainly having a dual perspective gives me a dual experience gives me a unique perspective in that again, both can be very successful. So happy to answer any questions from you all tonight. But thanks for having us. When Mike and when the mayor called and said, hey, we'd love for you to come to Stevens Point. Number one, I'm a pointer, so I'm glad to be back. I got my training at UWSP, and then I knew the right person for the question was given Dr. Ford's research on the matter. It's just, it's unmatched in Wisconsin. So I think you've got a great resource here in him as well.
Well, thank you both very much for coming here. This is the beginnings of looking into whether this is something we want to do. So the more information that we can gather helps us make the best decision in the long run. So I would say if we have questions, we could reach out to you via your email.
Absolutely.
Zach, I'm sure the mayor can put how to get a hold of you as well.
So I'm going to encourage you to come to our annual conference this fall, which is got a session on this very topic.
When is that?
The 23rd through the 25th of October in Madison/Middleton, because we have all these identities in
I
Wisconsin.
imagine they could probably contact the clerk's office if anybody wanted to attend.
They could call the clerk's office, and if you have a travel budget, which we encourage, you all to have some sort of stipend to be able to go to those things. But yes, we're proud to have that event available to everyone.
Yeah, actually, I'll second that. For any of the elders that haven't been to a league conference, it's very well worth your time. So,
I know you mentioned we're kind of right in between the two population, and when you look, we're kind of right smack in the middle. I hadn't thought about it, but the mayor had mentioned I formerly was up in Washburn on city council up there, and they have a city administrator / zoning administrator.
Clerk, I think.
And so, what combinations have you seen, and do some seem to be more problematic, and do some seem to work better?
Yeah, I don't know.
You're the researcher. I mean,
I can tell you that I think those dual positions, once again, is a function of size and budget. I think a lot of your smaller municipalities that can't afford to have a full-time administrator still want to have that, so they'll have someone who's a treasurer / administrator that they hire. I don't know if you have anything to say about the performance.
No, I think the size is a function, and I think there's also what's the priority. You see a fair amount of administrators, economic development director, kind of, just to give some emphasis and elevate, I think, that responsibility. But I would agree. I would concur on the size. Yeah.
Alder Morrow.
I have a follow-up. What I was concerned about was let's say we end up having an administrator and we don't like that administrator. Is that buyout? That's in the contract.
Right. Yeah.
And because I know that you said Ryan Lander had 7 and 6 years, and that had to cost them a lot of money to say we don't once you hire someone else, fire them, then do their buyout. So could you say how much of a cost average that you might have seen with that, or is that too much?
Average,
or
I can give you a scale. Yeah,
because one of the issues is like the cost of that, and that's one of the concerns. So if we do get someone and the council doesn't like him or her, and then they decide to go and they decide to fire that person, and then how much is the city going to be on the hook for? And that's something I think a lot of folks have some concerns for. Like, okay, we don't like this guy, we fire him, that costs the city $200,000, and then we have to find someone else to take their place.
Good question. The survey I've seen in the profession, the Wisconsin chapter of the ICMA organization does an annual survey of contracts in effect around the state. And I've seen it anywhere from probably just the 2 weeks to 6 months. In the Rhinelander example, the last contract that individual had a 6-month separation or severance in it. So it really varies. And generally, it's up to this body though to negotiate, for the terms of that contract. Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you from my experience in Oshkosh, we had an administrator for 16 years. He's retiring. By the end of it, we didn't have anything. So it differs dramatically. But yes, you'd want to make sure you draw that up in a way that protects yourself, because you don't want to. I'm a college basketball fan. I like Marquette, but I believe our second highest paid employee, Steve Wojciechowski, who hasn't coached there for like 3 years. Yeah, that's a situation you don't want.
Well, again, thank you all very much. Appreciate the information, and we'll kind of see where we go from here. At this point, I'd like to move on to item number 3. A request to approve new certifications with associated pay and amend Administrative Policy 3.01 Standard Benefits, Licenses, and Certifications. Manager Frosch, would you like to?
Sure. In the past, utilities had some already approved certifications, and the goal was to place that somewhere within our policy. And with the department heads, we identified there wasn't a policy per se, other than our CDL licenses. So we looked around different policies. We felt this was the best fit. Department heads met periodically to determine what beyond the job descriptions would be classified as an extra certification and pay. And they came up with a list, and we figured out a process of let's review this on an annual basis, and then this is what came of it.
So basically, we're just saying this is where we're going to place this in our Chapter 3.01, because it makes the most sense.
Yep, so you see some approved certifications already that are in the policy, and then the ones that are new are on the memo.
Any questions? Alder Guthrie.
Can I run through an example and make sure I'm understanding the included in the job description versus not? So under the department city treasury, if someone has a CPA license, it's a $2 an hour raise. Eligible position, just senior accountant is listed. So do I understand correctly that the senior accountant right now does not need to have a CPA? If we hired someone, or if someone were hired and eventually earned a CPA, this would be the differential. But that, by definition, anything on this list means that their job description does not include this certification.
Correct.
Did I get that right? Okay.
Yes, you're correct.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions from the committee?
I was curious, because I see part of the notes in there is the revision dates. How often do we look at this? Is that part of a regular review process, or is that just when something comes up?
Yeah, this is new to us, and so that we set some guidelines to review it annually. So if there are any new certifications, this is a policy so that department heads can go through this, and if there's a new certification that they would like to have, they can bring this forward and follow the process. And it all depends on funding. Most like anything that we have, we can approve it, but it depends on the funding.
Sure, great. Questions from the audience? Any other questions from the committee? Okay, would entertain a motion.
I'd move approval.
Okay, we have a motion by Lang and second by Steinmetz to approve the new certifications with associated pay and amend the policy, license and certifications. All those in favor would vote by saying aye. Aye. Opposed would vote by saying no. Ayes have it, and the motion is approved, and we are adjourned at 6:49.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.